California's Governor Gavin Newsom is suing the Trump administration over its tariff policy. The state is the world's fifth largest economy. It stands to lose billions as its tech and agriculture industries are heavily reliant on global trade. It's asking the court to declare the tariffs as void and block their implementation.
The Supreme Court may be preparing to challenge one of Donald Trump's most controversial economic tools, tariffs. During his presidency, Trump used a decades-old law, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, to impose sweeping tariffs on imports, claiming national security threats. Trump has had issues with the court in the past.
This week, a federal judge struck down Donald Trump's attempt to use the Alien Enemies Act to enact his mass deportations. It's a major blow to his efforts. It remains to be seen if the Trump administration will comply. Also this week, Columbia graduate student Mohsen Madawi was released on bail after being detained under equally dubious national security claims. And let's not forget Trump's beautiful tariffs overnight. One of his biggest sets of tariffs took effect, driving up prices on millions of goods. Michelle Hall, a Trump voter from Snohomish, Washington, tells the New York Times, quote, "Citizens are suffering. I wanted to have faith. I don't have that faith anymore." What do all these stories have in common? The arbitrary deportation sweeping up toddlers and legal residents alike, the crackdown on college students, the brutal tariffs hammering working families. In every case, Trump is doing these things not through the normal democratic process, but by invoking emergency powers. Not because of any clear and present danger, not because we're being invaded or attacked by college students or by Canada, but because declaring a national emergency or citing imminent national security concerns lets you do something unique in the American political system. It lets you bypass Congress. It sidesteps oversight. It gets you what you want, fast. For those tariffs, Trump claimed a, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat, end quote, from our trade deficit.
Critics argued these moves bypassed Congress and gave the executive branch too much control over trade policy, with Trump indicating that he would extend tariffs even further in a second term. The court appears ready to consider whether this exercise of power infringes the Constitution's separation of powers. The issue is who truly wields America's economic ammunition.
But that's a complete distortion of the concept. It's normal for a country to run trade deficits with some partners and surpluses with others. It's not an indication of a failing economy. In fact, it's not an indication of anything, really. Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Solow once explained the absurdity of this thinking using his barber as an example. He said, a chronic trade deficit with his barber who doesn't buy a damn thing from me. But of course, that doesn't mean his barber is taking advantage of him. The same logic applies to global trade. We export what we make well or have a surplus of, planes, fuel, agriculture. We import what others can make cheaper, like clothing. That's just how trade works. And Trump's math leaves out services altogether because we are the world's leading exporter of services. We run surpluses in industries like education, in entertainment, in finance. Okay, that's trade. No national emergency there. How about mass deportations? The president reached for a centuries-old wartime law meant for literal invasions by literal enemies of war and used it on asylum-seeking families. It's legally unsound, and this is important. None of this business of ignoring Congress and expanding executive powers started with Trump. Presidents of both parties have pushed the boundaries of executive power. George W. Bush gave us Guantanamo, where men were held for decades with no charges. Can't do that under the law in America. President Barack Obama expanded a drone war that operated in the shadows, often killing civilians outside of any declared battlefield. And let's be honest, when it's our guy in the White House, we often look the other way. Not because we're bad people, but because we trust him. He's on our side. We assume he's doing the right thing for the right reasons, even if that thing neither follows the letter nor the spirit of the law. We assume that power in the hands of someone we voted for will be used responsibly. But here's the danger. Every time we let our guy bend the rules, we make it easier for the next one to break them.
To know how we arrived here, it is significant to consider the origin of Section 232. Signed during the Cold War, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 authorized the president to probe and limit imports that could damage national security.
White House National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett. Kevin, good to see you again. So,
hey, Jake, good to see you.
The White House says everything that happened over the last week and a half went according to plan. Over the course of just a few days, the global market lost trillions in stock value, regained some of it, but not all of it. The strength of the dollar right now is plunging. Consumer sentiment is worse than at any time during the Great Recession. Is all of this part of the plan?
Right. In fact, let's talk about what the trade plan is, because I think that it's very, very important for people to understand, why we're doing what we're doing and how we got to the point where this is the right strategy. The bottom line is that in the United States, there are these things called 232s. You've heard people talk about it. It's a trade action where the government decides that there's something that's a serious threat to national security if we don't do something about it. And so an example, just hypothetical, would be, suppose that in order to protect ourselves from an adversary, we had cannons, but we had to buy the cannonballs from them. Well, then you could put a 232 tariff on the cannonball, and then we'd have to make it here, and then that would make it so that if we ever did have a situation where we were in conflict, that we'd had everything we need to protect ourselves. And so the 232 things were always excluded. They weren't covered by the new actions that you discussed at the opening. And so it's not like, so for example, semiconductors are the key important part of a lot of defense equipment, and there's going to be a semiconductor 232 that studies those things carefully and decides what has to be onshored in order to protect America. And so it was always the case in Annex 2 in the Reciprocal Act that semiconductors were going to not be covered by that action, because there's a 232 action that was announced in the executive order that is going to address it. And so I don't think that anything really should be a surprise if people stopped and studied, but it seems like a lot of the coverage, people are in a rush to get the coverage out and didn't really think through the logic of it, which is why we have a longer form show with you here, right, Jake, where we can talk about what exactly is going on. And then finally, why is it that people think that there is an emergency about this? Well, it's because, especially over the last 4 years, the influence of China into every little corner of our country has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it actually is the case that it's a very uncomfortable amount of Chinese input in our actual weapon systems, Jake, in our actual weapon systems. And so President Trump thinks it's urgent that we address these matters.
It was hardly ever utilized and used as a last measure for something such as arms reliance or critical resource deficiency during war. Before Trump, presidents rarely invoked Section 232. Nixon and Reagan utilized it in exceedingly narrow applications, but Trump employed it as a core tool in his trade arsenal. In the process, he not only reshaped trade arrangements, but he stretched what national security could be legally construed to mean. He even suggested tariffs on vehicles from Germany and Japan at one point, citing that foreign car imports somehow detracted from U.S. defense. The Supreme Court might oppose this and, as a result, face pushback from Trump.
Problem because Trump is facing an enormous number of legal challenges to many of the executive actions that he's taken since he was inaugurated in January, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how aggressively the administration might try to push back if they get rulings that are unfavorable to them. So I mean, this is always a tension in America. I mean, one thing that I would point out, going back to the point you just made about the states versus the federal government, I mean, no one is arguing here that it is the federal government that gets to decide what the tariff policy is. The legal argument is who in the federal government decides. And so I think that the California's lawsuit and potentially other business suits would say it has to be the Congress, and it has to be Congress specifically because that is where you have representation from all of the states and the many different voters and business groups that would be affected by this.
He eased tariffs on autos.
President Trump announcing tariff relief for automakers. Phil LeBeau joins us right now with the details on that. Phil, this is pretty complicated, but pretty important at the same time.
It is a little bit more complicated than I think people would like in terms of trying to understand it. But for the automakers, this provides a little more clarity. And here's what the White House has announced in terms of the new plan when it comes to auto tariffs with regard to foreign sourced parts. And we're not talking about anything that's USMCA compliant. We're talking about something that's being brought in from another country. Let's take an engine for BMW built in South Carolina. They have destacked the tariffs. So that engine, this eliminates some select multiple tariffs. Instead of also being slapped with an steel and aluminum tariff on that engine, it's just for the import of the engine itself. Year one, the offset is 15% of MSRP, and what percentage of that goes to foreign parts, and then year two, it goes down to 10%. Here's the president last night in Michigan talking about why they made this decision.
It's called a little flexibility. The guys were crying. They love it. Everything's good. But just in case we can't get everything in time, we gave them a little bit. So it's 15% of the parts, and then it's 10% of the parts. We give them a little time before we slaughter them if they don't do this right.
All right, in dollars and cents, how much might this help the automakers in terms of their bottom line? Tom Narayan at RBC Capital did this calculation. No offset. So before they put this change in place, it would likely have cost General Motors $12 billion. There you see $5 billion will be the impact with these 15% offsets for foreign parts. You see the same thing for Ford, for Stellantis, considerably less in terms of what the impact might be for the automakers. So that is certainly some relief there as you take a look at GM, Ford, and Stellantis. Remember, early this morning, Stellantis pulled its full-year guidance. By the way, so did Mercedes, so did Volkswagen. Everybody's pulling their guidance, almost everybody, within the auto industry. What about General Motors? Well, it said that its guidance, the one that was released in January, you can't rely on that. But we could get new guidance tomorrow. We'll be talking with Mary Barra, the chair and CEO of General Motors, first on CNBC, right here on Squawk Box, guys. We'll see if this clarity really does.
Legal commentators across the political spectrum started cautioning that Trump's invocation of 232 had strayed from its original purpose and established a perilous precedent under which future presidents would be able to circumvent Congress on nearly any economic matter. With Trump running on a platform of imposing a universal baseline tariff of 10% on everything imported, the lawsuits are piling up fast. Various trade groups and constitutional experts have brought cases contending that Trump's suggested tariffs push Section 232 to the breaking point. These baseline tariffs were crippling.
In the last few minutes, US President Donald Trump has announced sweeping tariffs on goods imported into the United States from all countries, including the UK. British-made products will face tariffs of 10% from this Saturday. 10% is the baseline tariff applying to all countries in the world. There will, though, be higher, more punitive tariffs on about 60 other countries, which Mr. Trump sees as the worst offenders when it comes to trade imbalances with the United States. For example, 34% tariffs on goods from China. Well, the president also confirmed a 25% tariff on foreign-made cars effective from midnight US time. He said that together, all these tariffs will raise hundreds of billions of dollars a year for the United States, making, in his words, America wealthy again. Well, the president has been speaking in the Rose Garden of the White House on what he's billed as America's Liberation Day, though for many around the world there are now fears of a global trade war, economic slowdown and recession. Well, tonight we'll have analysis and reaction from around the UK and across the world throughout the program.
Several federal courts have permitted the cases to go forward, and all indications are that one or more of them will end up in the Supreme Court by the end of this term. This time, however, the stakes are even greater than they were in 2018. Trump is not only threatening a few nations or industries, he is threatening the whole global supply chain. Economists say that tariffs across the board will increase prices to consumers, lead to trade wars, and lose American jobs.
As you said, there will be tariffs ranging from 10% all the way up to 50% being charged on different countries to export their goods into the United States. And Donald Trump explained that he has set these tariffs depending on how other countries treat US exports. Have a listen to what he had to say.
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple, can't get any simpler than that.
Now, by reciprocal, we should explain what that means, because it's not just a direct tariff for tariff. What's happened is that the White House have calculated all the different ways in which they see trade barriers. So that could be straight tariffs. It could be other non-tariff barriers, like, for instance, technical restrictions, maybe a ban on imports of something like genetically modified corn or hormone-injected beef, that sort of thing. If you need a license to import goods from America, that also counts. They talk about currency manipulation and even the theft of intellectual property. So there are lots and lots of ways in which they have come up with some kind of sum that they say represents the totality of the tariffs that American goods are faced when they are being exported into China or Cambodia or the EU or the UK, for instance. They've come up with a number which, for instance, in Cambodia's case is 97% is what they say the tariff on American goods going there is. So they're halving that and charging 49%. With the EU, they say that they had added up all of the different restrictions they see between trade between the US and the EU. They brought that to 39%, and that's why there's a 20% tariff going on. But other countries that don't fall under this heading, a blanket 10% tariff is being put on all other goods, and that's where the UK falls.
But for the court, the economic effects are not the only issue. The actual issue is constitutional. May a president unilaterally reshape America's trade regime in the name of national security as an across-the-board cover? Chief Justice Roberts appears more and more uneasy with how far the executive has stretched. Recently, in public speeches, he discreetly reiterated the judiciary as an independent check on abuse of government power. Without mentioning Trump explicitly, Roberts underscored that the courts must still be co-equal, particularly during times of political stress. Roberts and Trump's administration often clash heads.
Joining us now, Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington State. She's a member of the Judiciary Committee and ranking member of the Immigration Integrity, Security, and Enforcement Subcommittee. Congresswoman, thank you so much for taking the time. What's your reaction to this judge's decision saying the Trump administration cannot send migrants from several countries to Libya, and his warning against looking for loopholes to try to get around his order?
Well, I think it was an important decision because it was exactly a loophole that the Trump administration was trying to exploit to say we can send them to Libya under these circumstances. And this judge said, no, you cannot deport immigrants to third countries without due process. And I think that this is the key thing here. Libya in particular, if you think about this, we've obviously seen it with El Salvador and CICOT, a notoriously horrific prison in El Salvador where people were being sent illegally. But now with Libya, this is a country where we don't even have an embassy there. There is kidnapping. There is a do not travel advisory because of kidnapping, because of wars between different parties. And the prison that they were planning to send people to is, again, has been described as a hellscape. That is an actual quote. And there's rampant.
Legal experts note this could be the Roberts Court's moment of truth. Though the court has been criticized for its earlier rulings, most recently, its divisive ruling on presidential immunity, a robust dissent against Section 2, 3-2 abuse, could repair some of its institutional legitimacy. If the court does decide to hear the case this term, it will most likely be based on two main questions. First, does Section 232 provide the president with too much latitude without reasonable boundaries? And second, can the court define clear boundaries without overreaching its role? Conservatives who believe in originalism, or reading the Constitution as the founders did, might be between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they believe in strong executive authority in such areas as national defense. Constitution opposes it as it impacts all industries as a whole.
We are watching Wall Street as investors watching for progress on trade deals now digest the possibility of more tariffs. So the closing bell rang just minutes ago, the Dow down nearly 100 points. So let's take a look at our interactive stock market heat map brought to you by FinViz. It shows the top 500 stocks. Netflix, Warner Brothers, and other big names in entertainment, they landed in the red after President Trump called for a 100% tariff on all movies produced outside of the United States. So let's bring in CBS News correspondent Carter Evans live in Los Angeles to kind of break it all down. Hi, Carter. What's the reaction from Hollywood to this tariff announcement?
You know, it's been described as kind of a five-alarm fire in Hollywood. Everybody trying to figure out exactly what this means, because this was a pretty vague announcement. He did say 100% tariff, but on what? The revenue that the film generated, the revenue that it generated in the U.S., the revenue that it generated in other countries, the production costs. So no one's really clear on that. And also, the president has a record of going back and forth on these tariff issues. So a lot of studios right now are essentially hitting the pause button to wait and see what happens, what the president does.
Yeah, and it's not just foreign filmmakers that could be impacted. A lot of American movies are made abroad. So walk us through the potential impacts. It's kind of a gray area.
Right. So think about a movie like Mission Impossible. I mean, that's a movie that's shot all over the world, and not necessarily because it's cheaper to shoot in other countries, as it is in some cases, but because of the backgrounds there. That needed to be shot around the world. So what happens to a film like that's making billions of dollars? Is the tariff on the billions and the profit? So that's kind of what people are really concerned about here. And they say, especially for the smaller films, the smaller budget films, the independent films, it's going to stifle creativity because sometimes they do want to go to the cheapest place to produce the film, so they get more bang for their buck with their limited budgets. And if they're forced to shoot in the U.S.
On the other hand, most originalists contend that the Constitution granted Congress, and not the president, the sole authority to regulate commerce. A decision that reigns in Section 232 wouldn't merely rein in Trump, it would rebalance the original scheme of American government. For Chief Justice Roberts, the moment is symbolic as well. The court, over the past few years, has been dealt some serious blows to its legitimacy. From the Dobbs ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade, to the politically charged presidential immunity decision, trust in the institution among the public has plummeted. A principled approach to tariffs based on constitutional separation of powers might restore that trust without firing up partisan fury.
Terry Moran, who has covered the Supreme Court for years, and he's at the court tonight.
At the Supreme Court today, an historic upheaval. In a sweeping ruling that overturned a half a century of precedents, 5 justices ended the right of American women to choose abortion under the Constitution. The court upheld Mississippi's ban on abortions after 15 weeks by a 6-3 vote, and 5 of those justices went even farther, voting to overturn Roe v. Wade itself. Today's opinion is nearly identical to the draft that leaked from the court last month. Justice Samuel Alito rejecting the 1973 landmark ruling in Roe, scorning the idea that the Constitution protects a right to choose abortion. Roe was on a collision course with the Constitution from the day it was decided, Alito wrote. It is time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elected representatives. Chief Justice John Roberts joined the conservative majority in upholding the Mississippi law, but he insisted the court did not need to overturn Roe. Instead, he searched for some middle ground, pleading. None of this, however, requires that we also take the dramatic step of altogether eliminating the abortion right first recognized in Roe. And from the liberal wing, a scathing, agonized dissent. Justice Stephen Breyer arguing that Alito's ruling is based on nothing more than the fact that 3 new justices appointed by Donald Trump, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, cast decisive votes to overturn Roe.
Trump will not, of course, abide by any ruling quietly. His language has already become anti-judiciary, and any verdict that binds him is likely to instigate another round of political assaults. But Roberts understands that this moment transcends Trump. It is about restoring the guardrails that prevent American democracy from becoming an authoritarian state. The Supreme Court could rule on legal challenges.
And here's another if question, but again, with the tariff policy kind of changing week by week, if the administration were to say, okay, this damage has been too great to our small businesses, to the market, etc., we're going to undo everything we've announced since Liberation Day. Would these suits go away, or would that weaken any of the cases? Or because one of the questions being considered is the specifics of IEPA, would they still proceed?
Well, there's a lot packed into that question. Certainly, if the government stands down and rescinds the IEEPA-based tariffs, it would go a long way. It would certainly moot out any forward-looking complaint. You know, whether it moots the existing complaints depends on whether they also provide, whether they refund whatever tariffs have already been paid. And if they do that, then yes, I would expect the government to invoke the mootness doctrine that says, no harm anymore, so there's no reason for the court to get involved. And that wouldn't be, as a general matter, putting aside this particular administration, that wouldn't be unheard of, right? Government reconsiders actions all the time. But, time will tell whether this administration is going to reconsider its IEEPA authority to set tariffs. So it really depends on what actions the government takes, how far back they rescind their actions.
It's highly hypothetical and perhaps unlikely. One more prediction question for you. If the Supreme Court were to hear any one of these three cases tomorrow, how would you expect the nation's highest court to rule?
Well, good question, because this really brings to bear two different questions of administrative law that at least typically one would think this administration, being a conservative administration, is on the same side as the Supreme Court. But here they're not, and those two issues are deference to executive branch interpretations of statutes, which, now famously we know from last year's decision in Loper-Bright overruling Chevron deference. Arguably, I wouldn't even say arguably, I would say doctrinally, the interpretation of IEEPA is not one on which the court should defer to this administration. So that's a pure question of statutory interpretation, and as the Loper-Bright court articulated, that authority to interpret is vested entirely with the courts. So I would think, and so on that statutory question, I agree with the plaintiffs in these cases. There's nothing in IEEPA.
In a year when all three branches of government are under scrutiny, the Supreme Court has a unique opportunity to remind the country and future presidents that the rule of law is still relevant. So as the Supreme Court weighs in on Trump's controversial tariff powers, we're not just talking about steel or cars, we're talking about the very structure of American democracy. Can one man reshape the entire economy with a single justification of national security? Or will the judiciary finally draw a line in the sand? Whether you support Trump or not, this moment is bigger than politics. It's about checks and balances. It's about making sure no president, past, present, or future, can sidestep Congress and rule by decree. The outcome of this case could set the tone for how power is shared or abused for decades to come. And as America gears up for another election, the stakes couldn't be higher. Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.